those of you who are attending, can you hear us? If you could raise your hands. Good. So sound is working for everyone. So it's just about 7 o'clock. So we'll get started, and thank you for joining us this evening. We are also recording this presentation, so we'll make it available on our website for folks that couldn't join us tonight. So officially, good evening. I'm Chris Johnson, the director at the Attleboro Public Library. Thank you for joining us for the first of this year's lectures, which we're offering as part of our NEA Big Read Attleboro for 2020 in celebration of the wonderful novel Circe by Madeline Miller. This is a program that will discuss the woman suffrage movement, in particular in Massachusetts, and speaks to women's empowerment, which is an important theme in the novel Circe. Our speaker this evening is Barbara F. Berenson. Barbara is the author of Massachusetts in the Woman Suffrage Movement, Revolutionary Reformers, Boston Civil War, Hub of the Second Revolution, and Walking Tours of Civil War Boston, Hub of Abolitionism. And she's the co-editor of Breaking Barriers, the unfinished story of women lawyers and judges in Massachusetts. Barbara has earned her undergraduate degree from Harvard College and her law degree from Harvard Law School. And until recently, she worked as a senior attorney at the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court. She's on the boards of Boston by Foot and the Royal House and Slave Quarters. I do want to mention that this evening's program is made possible due to the generous support of the NEA Big Read. If you haven't done so yet, please pick up a calendar of all of this year's events that we have. And as most of you who have attended our programs before know, the NEA Big Read is a program of the National Endowment for the Arts in partnership with Arts Midwest. So thank you again for joining us this evening. Barbara, I'm going to turn off my video and turn over the screen to you, and we're all looking forward to hearing your presentation tonight. So thank you very much. I'll do the official applause for the group.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you all for inviting me into your homes. It is lovely to be here. Before I'm going to begin, I'm going to do the only part of the evening that makes me nervous, and that is practice screen sharing. So let's make sure that I get my PowerPoint set up and slide it over. Okay, so now I just need to be told that you can see the first slide and that when I go like this, you can see the second slide. Is it working?
Yes, it is working.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so what we're going to do tonight is talk about the national suffrage movement, but we're going to focus on a perspective that not too many people are familiar with, and that is the perspective of the story as it was led here from Massachusetts. And we're going to talk about why that is. And some of the factors that led me to write this book were thinking about a monument like this that some of you might have seen in the United States Capitol, the Suffrage Memorial. And you can see three figures that you might recognize in this memorial: Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and Lucretia Mott. And they are indeed very important, but they are only a piece of the story. More recently, this monument was unveiled in Central Park just last month in August of 2020. And of course, it depicts again Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, this time happily joined by Sojourner Truth. But there is so much more to the story than these figures, who all were largely from outside Massachusetts, although Sojourner Truth did reside here for some period of her life. So I decided some years ago that I was going to write a book that would focus on the women's suffrage movement from the perspective of Massachusetts. And what I explore in the book is this state's role at the center of the complete national narrative. And I discuss why this story has been obscured from view, why it is so little known. I can't discuss all of this tonight. We'd be here for hours. I wish we had time. But what I'm going to do tonight is highlight some key episodes that will give you a flavor of the significant role that Massachusetts played, and also talk about some of the lessons one can learn from the suffrage movement that I think are very relevant even today in our present times. So I'm going to begin at the beginning, which when it comes to history is very complicated. One of the things I used to ask audiences when we were lucky enough to do these talks in person is, by a show of hands, I often asked, how many of you have heard, read, been told that the women's suffrage movement began in 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York, when Elizabeth Cady Stanton organized the first ever convention to discuss women's rights? And usually, virtually every single hand goes up. And it's very interesting if you think about that, because something must have led Elizabeth Cady Stanton, along with Lucretia Mott, to decide that the time was ripe in 1848 to do something so radical as to call together the first ever convention to discuss women's rights. But seldom do people bother to peel that back and ask why, what came before that. And the answer, as I discuss in my book, is what was happening here in Massachusetts during the 1830s and early 1840s. And that is that Massachusetts was the nation's leading center of the young abolitionist movement going back to the early 1830s, when the abolitionist or anti-slavery movement was a very small movement. And part of the reason it was headquartered here in Massachusetts was because of this man, William Lloyd Garrison, who was originally from Newburyport, Massachusetts. He moved to Boston, and in 1831, he established a newspaper called The Liberator that was dedicated to the total eradication of slavery from the United States, which at that point, back in 1831, was a very novel and unpopular position. Garrison was a radical through and through, and one of the things he did is he invited Blacks as well as whites, and women as well as men, to join him in this new anti-slavery movement. And two of the first women who joined with him were an African-American woman named Maria Stewart, who sadly there is no surviving image of. But Maria Stewart began to speak out early in the 1830s in Boston to audiences of African-American men and women, decrying the evil of slavery and the injustices of racism. Maria Weston Chapman worked with William Lloyd Garrison on the Liberator newspaper, and she also helped to organize anti-slavery societies. Because one of the things that Garrison knew was that to build a movement, you have to organize. And in that era, it was very radical for women to be involved in public life at all, as we'll discuss. But even those who were radical anticipated that men and women would work separately. So Maria Weston Chapman organized what were called female anti-slavery societies, groups of women, neighbors, who would come together, talk about the evils of slavery, and try to persuade other people of their point of view. These activities were very unpopular because back in the 1830s, this is how women were supposed to be. Women were supposed to be confined to the domestic sphere, as it was called, the sphere of the home, taking care of the house, the husband, and the children. Women were not supposed to be involved in business or commerce, and certainly not supposed to be involved in public or political life in any way. So Garrison was violating this belief in the domestic sphere. Things really took off a few years later in the mid-1830s due to the efforts of these two women, Angelina and Sarah Grimke. And some people have learned about them more in recent years because a wonderful historical novel that came out some years ago called The Invention of Wings is based on the lives of Angelina and Sarah Grimke. In any event, Angelina and Sarah Grimke were from the South. They were born in Charleston, South Carolina. They grew up in this home, the daughters of a wealthy slave-owning family. But they became convinced of the evils of slavery. They left the South. They moved to Philadelphia. They joined one of these female anti-slavery societies. This one was run by Lucretia Mott, who was based in Philadelphia. And in 1835, Angelina Grimke wrote a fateful letter to William Lloyd Garrison. And in the letter, she praised the work that he was doing and said that in her opinion, abolitionism was a cause worth dying for. Garrison realized how wonderful it would be if he could recruit Angelina and Sarah to share with audiences in the North the stories of what Southern slavery was like in all its horrors. And remember, this is the 1830s, so it's a good 10 years before famous self-emancipated slaves like Frederick Douglass had appeared on the scene. Angelina and Sarah Grimke were trained by Garrison and his allies as anti-slavery lecturers. And in the summer of 1837, they embarked on a tour throughout Massachusetts organized by Maria Weston Chapman. And the plan was for Angelina and Sarah to travel around and speak to female anti-slavery societies. And they did so. But as they spoke out, men became interested and wanted to hear them too. And their audiences grew and grew and came to include men as well as women. The men who came may have come for a variety of different reasons, for entertainment, to support them, to make fun of them. It doesn't really matter. The point was they came. And the fact that women were speaking in public on a controversial political issue to audiences of women and men concerned many conservatives, most particularly the then very powerful Congregational ministers of Massachusetts. And the Congregational ministers issued a letter that was read from the pulpit in every Congregational church one Sunday that said in part that when a woman assumes the place and tone of a man as a public reformer, her character becomes unnatural and the way is opened for degeneracy and ruin. What did they mean by degeneracy and ruin? I think they meant something like this: the fear that life as they knew it would be turned topsy-turvy. So here, of course, in this cartoon, you have a woman putting on traveling clothes and getting in a coach driven by a woman, while her husband is the one who is at home doing the sewing and taking care of the baby. The Congregational ministers, of course, expected Sarah and Angelina Grimke to be chastised, to sit down, to be quiet. I'm sure you can all guess what happened next in the story, and that is the Grimke sisters did no such thing. They continued to stand behind the pulpit and speak out, but they also picked up their pens, and they wrote a series of very forward-looking public letters in which they articulated the case for women's rights. So Sarah, for her part, said that there are a few things which present greater obstacles to the improvement and elevation of woman to her appropriate sphere, not the domestic sphere, but her appropriate sphere, than laws that she's had no voice in establishing. And Angelina, for her part, said that she contends that woman has just as much right to sit in conventions, conferences, associations, and assemblies as man, just as much right to sit in the presidential chair of the United States. They were remarkable women. So as I said, this was 1837. So what are some of the lessons from the early beginnings of the fledgling women's rights movement? The importance of speaking truth to power, of challenging the injustices of the status quo, and persisting. And persisting will be a theme throughout, since of course the women's suffrage movement would take nearly a century to succeed. After the Grimke sisters, a number of other women picked up the baton and began to speak out. They included Lucy Stone of Massachusetts, who we'll talk about, Abby Kelly Foster, also of Massachusetts, and others. And it was these events, these women speaking out during the 1830s and into the 1840s that would pave the way for the Seneca Falls Convention, which we're now going to talk about. But I'm first going to give you a preview of the argument I'm going to make, because what I'm going to argue tonight is that despite the importance and familiarity of the Seneca Falls story, that the organized women's suffrage movement was actually launched right here in Massachusetts in 1850. So Seneca Falls came about when Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who had spent some years in Massachusetts, but was living with her husband and children in Seneca Falls, New York, got together one July day in 1848 with Lucretia Mott from Philadelphia, who was visiting her sister. And Stanton, Mott's sister, and two other women got together, and they discussed the new spirit abroad in the land and had a discussion about women's rights. And they decided, as an experiment, to call together a convention They gave 10 days notice. It was advertised in the local papers. It was a local convention. And the abolitionist reformist congregation, this Methodist chapel, loaned them their chapel for this undertaking. Before the convention began, Elizabeth Cady Stanton famously drafted a document called the Declaration of Sentiments. And in it, she set forth, using the Declaration of Independence as a model, many of the wrongs historically done to women, and made a claim for women's rights, broadly speaking, in many spheres: the right to higher education, to access to the professions, to divorce, to child custody after divorce, and the right to vote. The Seneca Falls Convention was a big success, but 300 people came, which was a lot, but then they all went home. There was nothing to carry it forward. And Stanton was very aware of this fact, because soon after the convention, she wrote a letter to a dear friend of hers in which she said, "Do you not think we ought to have a lecturer to travel all over the country and talk about women's rights?" And that reflected that Stanton wanted to know, now that we had had this convention, how do we create a movement? How do we keep the energy going? This sentence also proves how famous Lucy Stone had become so quickly. So who was Lucy Stone? Lucy Stone was born in Worcester County, Massachusetts, in West Brookfield. She grew up a farm girl. She was literate. And she became a local rural school teacher after finishing school at about age 16. Desperate to continue her education, she worked as a teacher, saved her money, and finally, in 1843, at age 25, she was able to travel to Ohio, where she entered Oberlin College. And if you're familiar with Oberlin College at all, you know that it itself was opened as a radical experiment, dedicated to educating Blacks as well as whites, and women as well as men. So Stone went to Oberlin, graduating in 1847, and while she was there, she had a chance to hear from famous abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison, like Frederick Douglass, who by now had arrived on the scene. And when she graduated in 1847, she became an anti-slavery lecturer. But she broke new ground because she also began to deliver wholly separate lectures on the subject of women's rights. Following the Seneca Falls Convention and a couple of other local conventions that were held, Lucy Stone and other Boston women abolitionists got together in the spring of 1850, and they decided that the time was ripe to call together what they called the first National Women's Rights Convention. They planned it in the spring and scheduled it for October. They wanted lots of time for planning, for word to spread. And a couple of significant things just about its title before it was even held. National. They wanted women to come from all different states. Now, national meant northern in this era, because all of these women were involved in the anti-slavery movement, needless to say, a movement that was most unpopular in the South. They called it the first before they even held it, because they wanted to build a movement. And they knew that before people went home after the convention, they wanted to make plans for the second convention, followed by the third, and so forth. They hosted it in Worcester, which was not only the home county of Lucy Stone, but a thriving manufacturing city, and also a very important transportation crossroads, going both north and south, and east and west. And amazingly, over 1,000 women and some men convened in Worcester in October of 1850 for a 2-day convention to discuss many issues involving women's rights, including the right to vote. As we'll talk about in just a moment, the movement becomes focused on the right to vote soon after the Civil War. The women who came to the convention in Worcester were largely like Lucy Stone. They were white, native-born, literate, and Protestant, but there were always some exceptions from the beginning. So for example, one woman who attended the Worcester Convention is Sojourner Truth, the self-emancipated slave from New York. After the Worcester Convention, as you can see from this slide, conventions were held nearly every single year during the 1850s. The young women's rights movement was still very small, but it was growing. More and more people were flocking to it, even though the numbers were still small. Susan B. Anthony, who I haven't mentioned yet, arrives on the scene in 1852. She was born here in Massachusetts, in Adams, but then her family moved to upstate New York, Rochester, and she attends the Syracuse Convention in 1852. And at that convention, she decides to pledge the rest of her life to the cause of women's rights. During the 1850s, it was Lucy Stone, Susan B. Anthony, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton who emerged as the trio of leaders of this young women's rights movement. Stanton mostly stayed home in Seneca Falls, where she was raising 7 children. But Anthony and Stone lectured, traveled, and became very, very close friends. Susan B. Anthony never married, as you may know. Lucy Stone did marry in 1855 and had 1 child, a daughter, who was born in 1857. One of the things that makes the suffrage movement very complicated to think about, write about, teach about, and so forth, is that you always have to think about what else was going on in American history. And so the decade of the 1850s, just as this young women's rights movement was growing, was also, as you probably all remember, the decade that was bringing the nation closer to civil war over the issue of slavery. So the conventions come to an end in 1860 because the Civil War begins, as you probably know, in the spring of 1861. We're going to very quick, so lessons before we get to the war. What are some of the lessons of the 1850s, of all these conventions? The importance of organizing, educating, and agitating for change. The Civil War, we're going to pass over very quickly. During the Civil War, the leaders of the women's rights movement, Stanton, Anthony, Stone, officially put the movement on hold so that they could dedicate their energy to supporting the Union war effort in whatever ways they could. But during the war, women gained many new skills, as women always have during wartime in this country, that would prove to be very useful after the war. So women, for instance, managed homes and farms and businesses while their husbands were away fighting. They organized the gathering and the creating of provisions, sewing, knitting, food to distribute to soldiers at hospitals and in the field. And these so-called sanitary societies would form the basis of women's clubs and other organized work among women after the war. So women gained many new skills during the Civil War that, as I said, would prove useful soon after. So the war comes to an end, as you know, in 1865, a Union victory. And after the war, there is a focused national conversation about the ballot and who should get the ballot. This was led in part by Frederick Douglass, who had become very famous, a leader among African Americans, who argued that African Americans, both free blacks and the formerly enslaved, must have the ballot. Because, as he said, the only right worth having in a democratic society is the ballot. Because without the ballot, he said, you always have to ask for rights. Please give me this right. Please don't take away that right. But once you have the ballot, you never have to ask. You could take the rights that you want by voting for them. Stanton, Anthony, Stone, and their female allies agreed in the importance of the ballot, but they hoped that what Congress would do during this brief moment when abolitionists were still in charge after the Civil War was adopt an amendment that would grant universal suffrage, suffrage for all adults, regardless of race and regardless of gender. And they submitted petitions for universal suffrage. I know you can't read the signatures on this petition, but the first 4 names on it are Anthony Stanton Stone and Lucy Stone's sister-in-law. But Congress decided it was, in their words, the Negro's hour, and they would pursue only suffrage for Black men and that women were going to be left out. They did this for a number of different reasons, but one very important reason was, in this country, there's often historically been an association between bullets and ballots. In other words, if you're brave enough to put on a uniform and be shot at, you should get to move to the front of the line when ballots are being handed out. And once Abraham Lincoln permitted African American men to fight on behalf of the Union, to join the Union Army, they enlisted in large numbers and fought with great valor. So they were deemed to move to the front of the line. Also, the Republicans, who still controlled Congress, and of course, this was the party of Abraham Lincoln, they were confident that African American men would support their party, the Republican Party, the party of Abraham Lincoln. They were less confident about how women would vote, and they suspected that women's votes might be based more on class or region of the country, and they didn't therefore think it was politically advantageous for them to expend political capital on such a radical proposition as seeking to enfranchise women. So women were left behind. On the heels of that, there was a schism among our friends, pitting Stone on the one side against Anthony and Stanton on the other. And these friends now would become bitter rivals. This came to a head in 1869 over debates concerning the 15th Amendment. And if you know your amendments, you know that the 15th Amendment is the amendment that would enfranchise African American men. Lucy Stone was very disappointed that women were left out, but she nevertheless pledged her support to the 15th Amendment. And she said that woman has an ocean of wrongs too deep for any plummet, and the Negro too has an ocean of wrongs that cannot be fathomed. I will be thankful in my soul if anybody can get out of the terrible pit of disenfranchisement. But Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony disagreed, and they refused to support the 15th Amendment. And they did so in very racist terms, suggesting that if not everybody was going to be given the vote, then white women should be enfranchised first before African American men. So Stanton said, for example, I will not support men of other races making laws for the daughters, and of course she means the white daughters, of Jefferson, Hancock, and Adams. And this disagreement over the 15th Amendment led these women of very strong will to develop a rivalry. The 15th Amendment is adopted to the United States Constitution. And on the heels of this, two different competing rival suffrage associations were formed. Anthony and Stanton formed the National Woman Suffrage Association that was based in New York, and they pledged to continue to work for a federal amendment to enfranchise women. They began a short-lived newspaper that lasted for 2 years. Lucy Stone began the American Woman Suffrage Association, based here in Boston, and she came up with the strategy that would prove to be the winning strategy. What Stone said was, it's fine to want a federal amendment, but how are you going to get it? And she said the only way that one could get it would be if state-by-state campaigns were undertaken to step-by-step amend state constitutions to allow women to vote. Because once women could vote in a critical number of states, there would be a critical number of congressmen and senators who would be beholden to those women voters, and then they could be persuaded to support a federal amendment. And that turns out to be just the way history unfolded. Lucy Stone also began a newspaper called the Woman's Journal that was published every single week from 1870 through 1920, through the entire rest of the suffrage movement. And she was inclusive. She welcomed Blacks and men into the American Woman Suffrage Association. The American Woman Suffrage Association, I argue, was the more vital branch of the divided movement. And the movement would stay divided for the next 20 years until there was a reconciliation, which we will discuss briefly, in 1890. So I hope if you've been following what I've been saying so far, you're thinking to yourself something like this. Gee, if what Barbara is telling me is true, why don't I know this? Why don't I know more about Lucy Stone, the Worcester Convention, the American Woman Suffrage Association, the Woman's Journal? And the answer is found in this book, History of Woman Suffrage by Lucy Stone and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Because one of the critically important things to always remember about history is that what we call history is not necessarily what happened. It's the story we are told about what happened. And undoubtedly, the most critical thing that Anthony and Stanton did during the years of rivalry was decide to write a history of the women's suffrage movement to date. They wrote the first 3 volumes of what would ultimately become a 6-volume work called History of Woman Suffrage. And writing during this period of rivalry, they largely wrote Lucy Stone and her allies out of the story. They didn't want to talk about the Worcester Convention, where neither Stanton nor Anthony had been present. And this is when they elevated Seneca Falls to the birth story of the women's suffrage movement. Sadly, Lucy Stone, although she criticized this work mercilessly in the Woman's Journal and accused it of being one-sided and so forth, never picked up the pen and never wrote her own competing version. And in the 1960s and 1970s, when departments of women's history were first formed and people began to write about and think more about and look back at the women's suffrage movement, these were the first volumes that people turned to. In more recent years, in universities, historians have taken a much broader and deeper look at the suffrage movement. But when it comes to popular culture, that really hasn't penetrated, and many, many people today still only know the names of Anthony and Stanton. So what are some of the important lessons to keep in mind? To always think about writing history. And when you're reading history, to question dominant narratives, to ask, how did they come to be? To consider the biases of who may have written, and whenever one has the opportunity, to pick up the pen. So what was the American Woman Suffrage Association so busy doing during these 20 years of the schism? Well, first of all, their headquarters was right on Park Street in downtown Boston, in a building that sadly no longer exists. One of the things that the American Woman Suffrage Association did was form state organizations, because as I mentioned to you, they were going to undertake the work of seeking to amend as many state constitutions as possible. So Julia Ward Howe, who had become very well known during the Civil War, when she penned the beautiful lyrics to Battle Hymn of the Republic, becomes one of the heads of the Massachusetts Woman Suffrage Associations. And similar organizations were formed in nearly every state and nearly every territory. African-American women, I mentioned to you, were welcomed by Lucy Stone into the movement. There were a number of significant local African-American women, but probably the most notable was Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin. She had been involved in abolitionism before and during the Civil War. Her husband, George Ruffin, became the first African-American graduate of Harvard Law School and the first African-American judge in Massachusetts. And not only did Ruffin join the Massachusetts Woman Suffrage Association and the American Woman Suffrage Association, but she also began an early club for African-American women based in Boston. And in 1895, rather extraordinarily, she called together the first ever national convention of Black women's clubs to come together and organize. This happened in Boston, and that was the predecessor of organizations like the National Association of Colored Women, the NACW. I told you we always had to ask about what else was going on in history. And one of the things that's very important to keep in mind during these years, 1870 to 1890, is that the reformist era of the abolitionist era and then the Civil War gave way to an era that, thanks to Mark Twain, has now been named the Gilded Age, an age of robber barons and wealth, the Republican Party. So the Republican Party ceased to be the party of reform and becomes a conservative party of business pledged to upholding the status quo. And any group pledged to uphold the status quo is not going to be good for reforms like women's rights. The Democratic Party, meanwhile, was the party of the working class, the party that also welcomed immigrants in. But many of these new immigrants that were flocking to American shores were, for example, Catholics from Ireland, Catholics from Italy, Jews from Eastern Europe, and others. And they were from themselves traditional and patriarchal societies, and there wasn't support in the Democratic Party for reform like women's rights, and certainly not for reform that they, the Democrats, associated with the hated Republican Party from its origins. So these would prove to be very difficult years for the women's suffrage movement. In addition, it was a conservative era in science. And science, of course, can be used for forces of good or bad, as all of you know. So here, for example, you have a very influential professor from Harvard Medical School talking about how terrible it would be if women did things like be able to vote or obtain higher education. He argued that women had a finite, limited supply of blood. And if too much blood were sent to their brains, then their ovaries and uterus and reproductive organs would not grow properly. There were also cartoons like this, which is just like the first cartoon I showed you, but slightly modernized because we're now at the later part of the 19th century. Again, showing what cartoonists were portraying, the risk to men that family life would be topsy-turvy if women did things like have the vote. Lucy Stone and her allies were very strategic and always inventive. And in a state like Massachusetts, when they realized that they weren't going to be able to amend the Constitution and get women the vote, Massachusetts by this point had a strong, powerful conservative Republican Party. They decided to try to get a foot in the door by obtaining school committee suffrage for women. Of course, what was more consistent with a woman's traditional role than educating children? And actually in 1879, the women of Massachusetts were enfranchised by the legislature and able to vote for school committee elections. But despite Stone and her allies' best efforts, they were not able to expand the franchise further in Massachusetts. But the brilliance of this state-based strategy was clear because there began to be some successes. And they weren't where Stone and her friends expected them in the East. Even though the movement had been invented, was born in the East, it was actually in Western states that the first successes were won. So the first 4 states to enfranchise women, for example, were Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and Idaho. Why that was is complicated, and of course, each state or territory has its own story. But in general, these were young, growing societies. They wanted to encourage women settlers. They had great respect for women who worked alongside men. And they didn't have wealthy robber barons, factory owners, conservative banks, and other institutions determined to maintain the status quo. So actually, women's suffrage would get its first foothold, as I said, in the West. But the years from 1870 to 1890 were difficult and slow going. In 1890, members of the next generation of suffragists, which included Lucy Stone's daughter, Alice Stone Blackwell, and other younger women, basically said to their elders, you know, we're having enough trouble as it is. We're not making very much headway, although we're trying hard. And young women don't have the patience for there to be 2 competing rival organizations. You are going to have to reconcile and form one association. And they agreed, and the National American Woman Suffrage Association was formed in 1890. But Lucy Stone sadly dies just a few years later of cancer. Stanton, who really never cared much for organizational work, goes off to England to live with one of her daughters. And it's Anthony who takes the helm of the brand new National American Woman Suffrage Association and would expertly lead it from 1890 to 1900 when she retired. She lives on until 1906. So what were some of the lessons of this difficult era? The importance of tailoring strategies as necessary, like seeking school committee, going to Western states, always persisting, always having confidence that somehow, no matter how long and winding the road, that justice will prevail. And of course, and I should really add, the importance of reconciliation when appropriate. We're now going to turn to the 20th century, and if we had another hour, I would try to walk you through the next 20 years. We don't have that long, but what I'm going to do is just introduce to you some of the factors and new leaders that would make success of the women's suffrage movement possible, given where we were in 1890 and the fact that success would come in 1920. During the Q&A, I'm happy to expand upon any of these points that you would like. So the first thing that happens is at just about the turn of the century, the Gilded Age gives way to a new era, an era that we now call the progressive era. And the progressive era, just as the name suggests, has the word progress in it. It was a reformist era. And an era of reform would, of course, be a better era for the reform of women's rights. And during the progressive era, many people in the country, even if they disagreed over the tactics, generally accepted that somehow the United States had to address some of the worst excesses of industrialization, of overcrowded cities, unsafe factories, child labor, government corruption, and so forth. But this is also, of course, an era of Jim Crow laws in the South, of racism in the North. And the suffrage movement would not be immune from the nativism, xenophobia, and racism of this era, as we'll talk about. It was also an era of new social currents, driven in part by new inventions. So the bicycle, which became very popular in the 1890s, Susan B. Anthony one time famously said that she felt the bicycle had done more to liberate women than any other single thing. Women got exercise. They had the ability to get around independently on their own. And the bicycle led to clothing reform. As you look at this picture, this clothing might not look very reformed to you, but compared to the way women had been dressing, this was far more comfortable and practical. Other new inventions, the telephone. Many women went to work as telephone operators. The typewriter led many women to become clerical workers. More colleges had formed and more women had access both to high school and higher education. Now, the number of women who graduated from high school was small, and the number, of course, that got college degrees was even smaller, but nonetheless, there was now a cadre of well-educated women in the country, and some of them would turn into suffrage leaders. So here are some of the new leaders of the 20th century. Another reason why it's so important to know more names than Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton is that neither of them, of course, lived until 1920. Lucy Stone, as I mentioned, dies in 1893. Stanton dies in 1902. Anthony dies in 1906. But there were many other women who would carry the momentum forward. So Carrie Chapman Catt, who was a brilliant organizer, succeeded Susan B. Anthony as head of the National American Woman Suffrage Association in 1900. Not only was she a brilliant organizer, but she was also a great fundraiser. I haven't had time in this short talk to go into fundraising very much, but of course, social movements, like everything, needs money. And one of the things that Carrie Chapman Catt did was reach out to wealthy women who typically were heiresses and inherited fortunes from their fathers, or widows who inherited fortunes from wealthy deceased husbands. And she persuaded a number of them to finance the suffrage movement. Very famously, somebody whose name you may know, and especially if you've been to Newport, Rhode Island, is Alva Vanderbilt Belmont, who lived in a home that we call Marble House in Newport, Rhode Island. Here are some of the other new leaders from Massachusetts. Maud Wood Park, who becomes a major national leader. She got to attend Radcliffe College, graduated in 1898. And while she was at Radcliffe, she and her friend were quite frustrated by the fact that many of their privileged classmates didn't seem to care about things like women's suffrage. And after they graduated, Maud Wood Park and her friend founded the first College Equal Suffrage League. And they invited college students and college graduates to join them in support of women's suffrage. This proved to be so important and successful that Carrie Chapman Catt recruited Maud Wood Park to travel all over the country organizing college equal suffrage leagues, which she did. Maud Wood Park would later go on and become the lead lobbyist in Washington, D.C. for the 19th Amendment for the National American Woman Suffrage Association. And after 1920, she was honored by becoming the first national president of the League of Women Voters, an extraordinary woman. Another one of my local favorites is Florence Luscomb, another privileged woman. She was able to attend MIT. Here she's shown distributing copies of the Woman's Journal. And Luscomb believed that the women's suffrage movement had to reach the opposed and the apathetic. She said, "You're always giving talks to people who already agree with you, the people who choose to come." She said we had to take the movement out of the parlor and into the streets. And this began to be the era of parades. And I suspect that some of you are familiar with images of suffragists, sometimes wearing white, marching in parades. Here, the suffragists are wearing academic uniforms because this is a college suffrage parade. Mary Kenney O'Sullivan, who was not originally from Massachusetts, but moved here, was very important. She was a labor union organizer trying to organize factory working women into labor unions. And she was a believer that the best way for factory women to benefit and to be able to improve their wages and working conditions was if they had the vote. So she helped to encourage working class women, many of whom then were able to prevail upon their husbands, to support the cause of women's suffrage on the theory that if women could vote, they might be more inclined to support things like maximum hour and minimum wage legislation. But the National American Woman Suffrage Association was not welcoming in general to African Americans. And this cartoon, it's a little hard to see it, but it is showing a white woman carrying a Votes for Women sign, motioning away an African American woman carrying a similar sign. There were, of course, some individual women in the National American Woman Suffrage Association who very much believed in racial equality, but that was not true for most of them, and certainly not at the leadership level. Why was this? I think there were two major factors. One, of course, the most obvious one is simple racism, which was and still remains, sadly, an important part of American society. And as I mentioned, this is still very much the Jim Crow era of legal segregation in the South and a lot of segregation in the North as well. In addition, the suffragists knew that ultimately, if they were going to get a federal amendment, they were going to have the support of 2/3 of the members of Congress, 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate, followed by ratification by 3/4 of the state. And if you do the math, it was clear to them that for a women's suffrage movement amendment to be adopted to the US Constitution, they were going to have the support of some Southerners. And so they were willing to drop any discussion of race and focus, as they put it, only on gender. To use a modern term, theirs was not an intersectional movement. They were not focusing on race and gender. They were focusing on gender alone. But there were still many African American women who supported the women's suffrage movement, even if they were not necessarily welcomed into it. Two famous local women were Florida Ruffin Ridley. She is the daughter of Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin. And you're all in Attleboro, I know, but if you were in Brookline, you would know that Brookline recently took away the name of a slave owner from one of its elementary schools, and that school is now known as the Florida Ruffin Ridley School. Mariah Baldwin also has a school named after her in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Both Florida and Mariah were school teachers, worked with Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin on the Women's Era Club and on this convention that I mentioned earlier, and continued to work on behalf of rights for both women and African Americans. Another important figure is Alice Paul, a name I suspect many of you are familiar with. Alice Paul was a part of the National American Woman Suffrage Association, but she left it in the 19-teens to form a separate, more radical, very small party called the National Woman's Party. And she, like a number of other young women, were frustrated by what they considered the slow and plodding pace of the National American Woman Suffrage Association. Alice Paul, as she put it, wanted deeds, not words. And it was the young woman in the National Woman's Party who did things like picket in front of the White House. And I suspect that many of you have seen these pictures. Some of these women were arrested. They were accused of trespassing and imprisoned. And when they were put in prison, they claimed that they were political prisoners and demanded to be treated as such. And when that didn't happen, they did things like go on hunger strikes. And that brought a wave of popular attention to the women's suffrage movement, and also some grave anger at how these women were treated. So what were the importance of some of these different factors that helped to achieve success of the women's suffrage movement? Alliances, I mentioned to you, college women, society women who were a source of prestige and money, labor, the importance of money. You always have to follow the money and think where money is going to come from in our society when you want to make change. The importance of having a varied repertoire of strategies and tactics. It's interesting because the National American Woman Suffrage Association thought that what Alice Paul was doing, those pickets and arrests and so forth, was setting back the cause of women's rights. Alice Paul, for her part, felt that she was the only one accomplishing good and that the National American Woman Suffrage Association was just spinning their wheels. But looking back 100 years later, we know that both kinds of strategies were important. You needed the polite lobbyists to try to persuade people to vote a certain way, and you also needed the militants in the street bringing waves of public attention to the cause. So really what you often need are varied kinds of tactics. And it's important, though, as we look back and evaluate this movement, to remember to criticize it as well, that it was focused on gender alone. As I said, it was not a movement about racial equality. So the 19th Amendment does come to pass. We can talk more during the Q&A about the nitty-gritty, if you like, of how we got there. I also, of course, discuss it in detail in my book. And it's very important, though, as we celebrate and commemorate the 19th Amendment, which enfranchised women in 1920, that we recognize it not as a period or an endpoint, but simply as a milestone. It was a great victory indeed, but it's important to keep in mind that it was an incomplete victory and that some women were left out. No sooner, for example, was the 19th Amendment adopted than African-American women in the South were disenfranchised, stripped of their new right to vote by the same Jim Crow laws that had disenfranchised African-American men. Native American were left out until at least 1924, and in many states for a great deal longer. Asian Americans, many Asian American immigrants were left out until the 1940s and 1950s. It's also important to remember that the struggle for the vote continues today. All you need to do any day is to read the newspaper, and you know that issues of who may vote, who has access to the ballot, are very much contentious issues as we sit here today in September of 2020. But the story of the 19th Amendment is a powerful story that above all should remind us all that the greatest tool in the democratic toolbox is the ballot and the importance of exercising that right to vote. So what I am going to do now is stop sharing my screen so that I can see or at least hear all of you. And I would love to hear comments, questions. And as I mentioned a couple of times in my talk, please feel free to ask questions that go beyond what I had a chance to discuss, since of course in a short talk, all I have a chance to do is to touch on some of the highlights, but I'm happy to have you ask much more questions about wide-ranging topics. And thank you.
Thank you, Barbara, that was great. So you can use the chat box to type in a question, but if you want to just raise your hand, then we can unmute you if you'd rather just ask your question as well. So whatever your preference is. I had a question. What inspired you, Barbara, to, go so deeply into this movement and learn so much about it, and in particular the Massachusetts angle of it?
It was a number of factors, but I had written a book, as you mentioned in my introduction, on Boston's abolitionists. And as I was working on that, I got to know the Grimke sisters and Lucy Stone and realized how remarkable it was that so many people begin the story of the women's rights movement in Seneca Falls when really so much had happened earlier. And so I think that's what first motivated me to dig. And once at the very beginning, when I began digging, I wasn't quite sure what I was going to find. And I found just the most remarkable, amazing stories of important women from Massachusetts. There were also important women operating in other states as well, of course, but no state, with the possible exception of New York, where Anthony and Stanton were from, contributed as many leaders as the state of Massachusetts. I also spent a lot of time thinking about why it is that the story is so poorly known. I gave one answer during my talk, and that, of course, is who writes the history. But I also think that there's another reason that I discuss somewhat in my book, and that is by the time 1920 comes around, a number of states, over a dozen states, had amended their state constitutions and enfranchised women. And historians have tended to give those states the most attention. And they include New York, which enfranchised women in 1917. And Massachusetts, as I mentioned, never amended its state constitution to give women the vote. The women of Massachusetts didn't receive the vote until 1920. And I think that led a lot of people to overlook the significance of the state. In other words, they must have assumed, how could Massachusetts be so important if it never gave women the right to vote? And the answer was that the ideas, the leadership was spawned here. It's just that a lot of the results were implemented in other places.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, and the way that you focused also on being aware of who wrote the history. I mean, we see that now with, rewriting of history in our country, unfortunately, in other places as well. But you just assume because someone wrote the book, that tells the whole story, but it certainly leaves a lot out.
And of course, we see it also in discussions about public monuments.
Mm-hmm.
Who erected them and why did they erect them? I mean, you always have to ask, who did it and why they did it and what was their motivation.
Yes. Does anyone in our audience have any questions that you would like to ask Barbara? As I mentioned, you could put it right into the chat, or if you want to just raise your hand, we can turn on your mic.
And remember, there's no such thing as a silly question or an ignorant question. And I always learn a lot from my audiences too, so I hope that
with that preface, I actually have a question.
Sure.
I'm not the scholar that you are in the topic. So when you say that certain states, especially out west, gave women the right to vote way ahead of this amendment, what did that mean for elections? They were only able to vote for local and state elections?
No, in our country, elections are really controlled by the states. I mean, the only federal amendments that affect voting rights are the 15th Amendment, which barred, although it was then violated by Jim Crow laws, but barred discrimination on the basis of race, and then the 19th Amendment. So no, women were able to vote, including for president, in these Western states. And that is part of what ultimately propelled Congress to act, because you had women from a dozen states able to vote, and those represent, it was the Lucy Stone strategy carried out. Those congressmen, those senators, they knew they were accountable to women voters in their own states. And what eventually happened is, as the tide, women's suffrage, Carrie Chapman Catt said, it was like a slowly moving glacier. It might move slowly, but it was inexorable. It was ultimately going to crush everything in its path. And as more and more states began to enfranchise women, you had some politicians worried that if they didn't finally jump on this new bandwagon and support it, that then women might be enfranchised and punish them for their opposition.
Good point.
In fact, there's a wonderful cartoon that I didn't show tonight that shows some, conservative male politicians at the last moment jumping onto a bandwagon that's called Votes for Women.
Yep, always comes down to the vote, I guess, for folks that are already in office. They're very anxious to get that vote.
Right.
Okay. Well, I'm not seeing any questions from our audience.
See one raised hand.
Oh, I see a hand. Okay, here we go.
Yay, maybe it'll be another.
Did you want to ask the?
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to get your kind of thought, like I trying to keep this politically correct, but you have sometimes, like I watched with Hillary Clinton when she was running, and there seemed to be women that were just against her because she was a woman. When you listen to their argument. So I wonder, in the suffrage, were there women that were sometimes even more volatilely against this women's right to vote than maybe even some men? And did you do any research on that?
Yes, I'm so glad you asked that. One of the things that's so challenging about a short talk is that you have to pick and choose what to include and what to exclude. And one of the things I talk about extensively in my book that I didn't get to talk about tonight is the anti-suffragists who were women. Many anti-suffragists were men, of course, but Massachusetts, in fact, had the leading contingent of anti-suffragists. They were mostly wealthy women married to men who occupied positions of power and prestige, and they, just like their husbands or fathers, wanted desperately to maintain the status quo. But I assume you're familiar with Phyllis Schlafly, and if you just imagine dozens of or hundreds of Phyllis Schlaflys operating 40 years earlier, 50 and more years earlier, there was a strong contingent of anti-suffragists. Who were they? I mean, of course, there were many women who simply were apathetic or uninvolved or too busy trying to raise their children, take care of their husband and house and so forth. But the ones who had the time to be active in the opposition to the women's suffrage movement were, by and large, women of privilege who viewed themselves as being on a pedestal of privilege. And Lucy Stone and her colleagues would try to convince them that this so-called pedestal of privilege was really nothing more than a gilded cage. But, you know, just like women nowadays have, you know, the women who oppose the Equal Rights Amendment, for example, or seem to do other things that seem very much against a woman's own interest. It was very comparable. So I'm glad you asked that.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was a great question. I guess I just have one final question, unless there's anyone else in the audience that has a question. Is you were mentioning how it got sort of championed originally by, you know, Lincoln's Republican Party. Where along the way did it kind of switch over, where it seems that women's rights seems to be more affiliated now in history with current history with the Democratic Party versus the Republican Party?
I mean, to really answer that in full, you really have to go through and discuss political parties and their realignments, you know, historically a number of times over history, going back to the Civil War and all the way up to modern times. I mean, there were a number of different realignments. You know, one big shift, of course, occurred during Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal, when the Democratic Party became, you know, associated with certain kinds of progress. But women's rights in the modern era, like when you look back to the 1960s and 1970s, you may or may not, the audience may or may not know, but the Equal Rights Amendment, for example, was embraced by both the Republican and the Democratic Party. And one of my favorite relatively modern photos from the 1970s is a picture of Lady Bird Johnson, the widow of Lyndon Johnson, Rosalind Carter, the wife of Jimmy Carter, and Betty Ford, the wife of Gerald Ford, all at a convention in support of the women's rights movement. And the real turning point, the one that I think your question refers to, really comes about in 1980. When the Republican Party is taken over by Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan embraces Phyllis Schlafly, Jerry Falwell, the moral majority. By this point, of course, Roe versus Wade has been decided, and the Republican Party becomes the party of social conservatism. And in 1980, it's when the Republican Party drops support, for example, for the Equal Rights Amendment from its party platform. And so sort of this modern gender gap that we see now and that is talked about a lot, although it depends on the election how big or small it may be, is a phenomenon that began in 1980 and has waxed and waned ever since. And of course, one of the many questions as we look ahead to November is what kind of gender gap we'll see. And we know we'll see a gender gap because the women are more democratic these days, but it's all about the size of that gap.
Mm-hmm. And if folks actually get out to vote.
Yes, that too.
Well, that was wonderful. I really appreciate your time this evening. It was a very interesting talk, and thank you again for presenting. When we started talking about this way back last winter, I feel like it was, we were talking about an in-person presentation, so it did morph into this, and I'm happy we were still able to offer the talk, and thank you for allowing us to record it. So that way you can reach many more of our Attleboro Library members. So thank you again for your time, and it was
Thank you
wonderful.
very
And
much.
thank you to the audience for joining us.
Thanks. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye now.